The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter, A Tale of Destiny and Coastal Whispers. Chapter 1. The Call of the Coast. The scent of salt and pine was the first thing Sarah Miller noticed. A bracing, nostalgic embrace that pulled her back across 7 decades. At 70, with her professional life as a revered librarian now neatly shelved, she had returned to the small, windswept coastal town of Port Blossom, Maine. Her ancestral home, a sturdy clapboard house that had weathered a century of Atlantic gales, sat stoically on a rise, waiting for her. It was less a return and more a surrender to a persistent, lifelong summons. For as long as Sarah could remember, dreams of a lighthouse had haunted her sleep. Not just any lighthouse, but the old Port Blossom Light, a stoic sentinel perched on a craggy promontory just beyond the town. In her dreams, its beam cut through swirling fog. Accompanied by the insistent whisper of voices on the wind, voices that called to her, soft and indistinct, yet filled with an undeniable urgency. The lighthouse, now abandoned, its lamp long extinguished, had always held a peculiar, magnetic pull over her, an enigmatic presence in her subconscious. Her mother, Mary, had been a lighthouse keeper there in her youth, one of the last female keepers before automation. Mary had been a woman of quiet strength, but also of deep, unshakable sorrow. She rarely spoke of her time at the light, especially not of the Great Storm of '55, the cataclysmic event that had claimed her fiancé and shattered the coastal community. After that, Mary had left the light, left Port Blossom, and never looked back, taking her grief and her silence with her. Now, settled in the old house, the dreams intensified. They were no longer vague impressions, but sharp, almost visceral experiences. She saw flashes of churning gray seas, heard the mournful cry of gulls, felt the spray of crashing waves on her face, and the whispers. They were clearer now, distinct voices carry on the sea breeze, just beyond her comprehension. Shadows, too, flickered at the edge of her vision, fleeting, human-like forms at the periphery of her perception, gone the moment she tried to focus. The locals, a hardy, insular breed, viewed the old light with a mixture of reverence and unease. Haunted, some would mutter. The spirits of the sea, they call out from there. Others would whisper, their eyes wide with superstition. Sarah, a woman of logic and order, tried to dismiss it as the echoes of grief, of old age, of her mother's unspoken trauma. But a part of her, a part that defied reason, knew it was more. One blustery afternoon, driven by an inexplicable compulsion, Sarah drove her dusty sedan down the winding gravel path that led to the promontory. The lighthouse stood stark against the turbulent sky, its white paint peeling, its windows dark and empty, a relic of a bygone era. A rusty gate, half off its hinges, marked the entrance to the old keeper's cottage, now a ruin. As she stepped out of the car, the wind whipped around her, bringing with it not just the smell of the ocean, but something else, something ancient and primal. A faint, almost imperceptible murmur seemed to emanate from the very stones of the lighthouse. A low thrum that vibrated in her chest. She spent hours walking the rugged shoreline, the sound of the crashing waves a constant rhythmic backdrop. As dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, a figure emerged from the shifting fog down the beach. It was Old Man Hemlock, a weathered fisherman, a fixture of Port Blossom, who had lived his entire life in the shadow of the lighthouse. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes the color of the deep sea. He carried a net over his shoulder, his movements slow but deliberate. "You're Mary's girl," he rasped, his voice gravelly, like stones tumbling in the surf. He offered no further greeting, only a knowing gaze. "Come back to the light, have ye?" Sarah nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "I suppose so. I'm Sarah." Hemlock nodded slowly, his gaze drifting towards the silent tower. "That lighthouse, she has her own memory and her own secrets. Your mother, she knew them, had a special connection to it, she did. More than just a keeper." He paused, his eyes fixed on some distant point on the horizon. "The sea, it gives and it takes, and sometimes it speaks. If you listen close enough." He then turned and disappeared into the fading light, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers. A chilling sense that his words held a deeper meaning she couldn't yet grasp. His enigmatic words only intensified her feeling that the lighthouse held more than just historical significance. It held a living, breathing history, a whisper from the past. Chapter 2. Echoes on the Wind. Driven by Old Man Hemlock's cryptic words and the escalating intensity of her dreams, Sarah delved deeper into the history of Port Blossom Light. The local historical society archives, a musty room filled with forgotten ledgers and brittle photographs, became her second home. She learned that the lighthouse had a long, tumultuous past, battered by countless storms, a silent witness to countless tragedies and triumphs. But it was her mother, Mary, who held the most compelling mystery. Mary had been appointed assistant keeper in 1952, a rarity for a young woman at the time. Photographs showed her vibrant and youthful, her dark hair pulled back, a determined glint in her eyes. In some, a handsome young man stood beside her, his arm around her waist, their smiles radiating an innocent joy. His name was Tommy Eldridge, a local fisherman, her fiancé. The records leading up to the great storm of '55 were sparse, almost eerily so. A few newspaper clippings detailed the devastation, the lives lost, the sheer force of nature, but little about the lighthouse itself or Mary's role. The official report stated Mary had been overwhelmed by the storm's ferocity, unable to maintain the light, contributing to the shipwreck. It painted her as a victim, a young woman unable to cope. But Sarah knew her mother. Mary was resilient, strong. The narrative didn't fit. She started frequenting the local diner, a hub of gossip and local lore. Over lukewarm coffee and blueberry pie, she listened to the old-timers. They spoke of the storm in hushed tones, of the unnatural ferocity of the waves, of sounds that were not of this world. Some mentioned Mary with a strange reverence, others with a lingering suspicion. She was different, that Mary, had a way about her. One old woman mumbled, stirring her tea, could feel the weather coming before any barometer, almost like she heard it. The whispers intensified, becoming more coherent. They were disjointed phrases, fragments of conversations, cries for help, always accompanied by the sound of crashing waves. "Mary, the light, save us, he's gone." Sarah would wake in a cold sweat, the voices echoing in her ears, her heart pounding. She tried to rationalize it, grief, stress, the power of suggestion, but the feeling of presence was undeniable. One afternoon, while sifting through a box of her mother's old things, tucked away in the attic of her own house. She found it, a hidden compartment at the bottom of an antique cedar chest. Inside, beneath layers of moth-eaten lace, was a small leather-bound journal. It was Mary's. Written in a neat, elegant hand, it spanned the years leading up to the great storm. Mary wrote of her love for Tommy, of her devotion to the lighthouse, of the solitude and peace it offered. But then, the entries shifted. She began to speak of a feeling, a knowing that went beyond mere intuition. She described vivid premonitions of storms, not just atmospheric changes, but a deeper, almost psychic awareness. She spoke of the voices of the sea, a chorus of ancient sounds that would warn her of impending danger, guide her through the densest fog. October 17th, 1954. The sea spoke to me today. A low hum beneath the waves, a whisper of anger. There's a great storm brewing, not just of wind and rain, but of something deeper. It calls to me. January 3rd, 1955. The voices are growing louder. They speak of souls lost to the depths, of currents that pull and drag. It is a terrible gift, this knowing. It takes a piece of me each time. The journal entries grew increasingly desperate, leading up to the fateful date of the storm. Mary wrote of trying to warn the town, of being dismissed as superstitious, of feeling helpless as the ominous whispers grew to a roar. The last entry, dated the day before the storm, was frantic. March 15th, 1955. The voices are screaming now. A terrible, hungry sound. Tommy, he's going out. He doesn't believe me. Oh, my love, stay ashore. The light must stay strong. I must save them. I must find a way. The sea demands a price. The journal ended there, just pages before the official date of the storm. The omissions screamed louder than any words. It was clear Mary had a unique connection to the lighthouse, a rare, almost mystical gift. But what had happened during the storm? And what price had the sea demanded? Seeking answers, Sarah began to visit the lighthouse itself daily. She would sit within its cold, empty stone walls, listening to the relentless roar of the ocean, feeling the wind whip through the broken windows. The whispers were no longer just in her dreams. They were here, in the very air around her, trying to break through the veil of silence. Chapter 3. The Researcher and the Relic. Sarah knew she needed help to understand the depths of Mary's journal. The scientific, logical side of her was struggling to reconcile her mother's words with reality. The idea of voices of the sea and terrible gifts felt like something out of folklore, not family history. So she sought out someone who specialized in the unusual. Her search led her to Dr. Ilara Thorne, a young, ambitious researcher from Boston University, specializing in parapsychology and local legends. Ilara, barely 30, possessed an unusual blend of academic rigor and open-minded curiosity. She had published several papers on geographical anomalies and their reported paranormal phenomena, often focusing on coastal areas. Sarah found her online, drawn by an article Ilara had written about energy imprints in ancient structures. Ilara arrived in Port Blossom a few days later, her car loaded with electronic equipment and an air of eager anticipation. She was fascinated by Mary's journal, by Sarah's dreams, and by the sheer atmospheric presence of the old lighthouse. "This is incredible, Mrs. Miller," Ilara said. poring over the journal's pages, her fingers tracing Mary's elegant script. The consistency of her descriptions, the detail of her premonitions. It's not just a heightened intuition. It sounds like a rare form of sensory resonance, or perhaps even a deep, genetic, empathic connection to the environment. The voices, they could be energetic imprints of past events, amplified by the unique geology of this promontory and the emotional intensity of the people involved. Alara set up an array of sophisticated sensors within the lighthouse: electromagnetic field detectors, infrasound recorders, thermal cameras. She began charting the frequencies of the whispers Sarah heard, analyzing energy fluctuations within the tower. Sarah, initially skeptical, found herself increasingly convinced by Alara's methodical approach, which sought to measure and categorize the seemingly unmeasurable. "The lighthouse isn't just a structure, Mrs. Miller," Alara explained one evening, reviewing spectral analysis graphs. "It's a focal point, a receiver. It absorbed the emotional and energetic output of everyone who lived here, especially someone as attuned as your mother clearly was. And you, Mrs. Miller, you share her unique energetic signature. It's a familial resonance. You're picking up echoes." The whispers, under Alara's observation, became clearer to Sarah. They were not random. They coalesced around specific times, often coinciding with moments of high tide or significant weather changes. They spoke of Tommy, of desperate calls from the sea, of Mary's frantic attempts to save him, to warn the town. One afternoon, during a particularly heavy fog, the whispers in the lighthouse coalesced into a distinct, agonizing cry. "The current! It pulls us down. Mary, the light! Save my boy!" Sarah reeled, clutching her head. "That's Tommy. That's his father calling for him." The voices were real. They were not just echoes of fear, but imprints of a terrifying reality. During a break, Sarah revisited Old Man Hemlock, seeking more pieces of the puzzle. She found him mending his nets by the docks, his weathered hands moving with practiced ease. "The lighthouse, she has her secrets," Hemlock repeated, his gaze distant. "And Mary, she tried to fight the sea, but the sea, it always wins, unless you give it something precious." "What do you mean, give it something?" Sarah pressed, her voice urgent. Hemlock looked at her, his deep-set eyes piercing. "Your mother, she had the gift, the knowing, but it was also a burden. It showed her things, terrible things. The great storm, it almost took everything, but she fought. And the sea, it demanded a price. A life for a life, a fate for a future." He paused, then whispered, "Or a soul for a soul." She was desperate to save Tommy, and she lost him anyway. But not everyone. He looked away, turning back to his nets, refusing to elaborate further. His words, though cryptic, sent a chill down Sarah's spine. A life for a life, a fate for a future. Chapter 4. The Bargain with the Waves. Alara's equipment continued to pick up strange energy fluctuations around the lighthouse, particularly strong at the base of the tower where Mary's living quarters had been. The combined data from the journal, Sarah's experiences, and Alara's scientific readings painted an unsettling picture. Mary possessed a rare, profound empathic connection to the sea, a gift that allowed her to feel its moods, hear its silent calls, and see its impending dangers. But it was a gift that came with a terrible cost. One evening, as a storm began to brew, mirroring the conditions of the Great Storm of '55. Sarah and Alara were inside the lighthouse. The wind howled, the waves crashed against the rocks with thunderous force, and the ancient stone groaned. The whispers in Sarah's mind became a cacophony, a swirling vortex of screams, cries, and the desperate calls for help from the lost mariners. It was overwhelming, terrifying. Then a single voice broke through the din, clear and strong, though filled with anguish. "Save my boy, my Tommy. I beg you, take me instead." It was Mary's voice, younger, desperate, full of a fierce maternal love. Sarah collapsed, clutching her head. "It's her, my mother. She's here. She's reliving it." Alara, checking her equipment, confirmed a massive spike in energy. "This is not just an echo, Mrs. Miller. This is like a direct transmission. Your mother, she's trying to tell you something critical." Suddenly, the fragmented whispers in Sarah's mind coalesced into a vivid vision. She saw her mother, young Mary, huddled in the lantern room, the storm raging outside, waves crashing against the glass, the lamp flickering. Mary was holding a small silver locket, clutching it like a talisman. Her face was contorted in anguish, tears streaming down her cheeks. She was speaking, pleading, to the tumultuous sea, to something unseen but powerfully present. "I give you my fate, my future. Take it. Take my love for him. Take my memory of him. Take my happiness. Just spare my son, the one that carries his name. Let him live. Let him find shore." The vision was so real. Sarah could feel the cold spray on her face, taste the salt on her lips. She saw Mary collapse, utterly spent, as the light miraculously flared brighter, piercing the storm with an unnatural intensity, guiding a small fishing boat, Tommy's boat, through the impossible waves towards the distant shore. The vision faded, leaving Sarah trembling, breathless. Old Man Hemlock's words echoed in her mind. "A life for a life, a fate for a future." And Mary's frantic journal entry, "The sea demands a price." "She made a bargain," Sarah whispered, her voice raw with revelation. "My mother made a bargain with the sea, to save Tommy. Not her fiancé, but a different Tommy. A child. His child, her son." Alara looked at her, stunned. "Her son? But you're her daughter, Mrs. Miller. You were born years after the storm." "No," Sarah said, a new, agonizing truth dawning on her. "Not my Tommy. Tommy Eldridge, her fiancé, was lost. But the child, the one that carried his name, he must have been their secret son, a son she was pregnant with but kept hidden. Perhaps because of the stigma, perhaps because of her duties at the light. She sacrificed her future, her happiness, her memory of Tommy Eldridge, even perhaps the memory of that secret child, to save him. She gave up her connection to him, to protect him, to let him live." A locket. It must have been his. Over the next few days, Sarah and Alara painstakingly pieced together the final threads of the mystery. Old Man Hemlock, finally convinced by Sarah's undeniable connection to the lighthouse and the veracity of her visions, shared the full, painful truth he had carried for decades. Mary and Tommy Eldridge had a secret son, also named Thomas, born in late 1954, just months before the storm. They had kept him hidden, raised by Tommy's ailing aunt, fearing the judgment of the rigid coastal community and the implications for Mary's career as a keeper. During the storm, Tommy Eldridge had been out fishing, caught unexpectedly. But his boat wasn't the only one in distress. Their son, Thomas Jr., just a baby, had been inadvertently caught on another small vessel, attempting to escape the storm's initial fury, a vessel belonging to a distant cousin. Mary, in her desperate plea, had seen not just Tommy Eldridge, but their infant son in the storm's path. She had used her powerful, intuitive gift to guide that boat, that life, to shore. But in doing so, she had paid the ultimate price. She had severed her connection to the child, almost erasing his memory, her joy, her very heart, to ensure his survival. Her gift, her sacrifice had protected him. She had lost her fiancé, suffered a profound trauma, and then, subconsciously, had buried the memory of the son she'd saved, as if part of the bargain was to forget him, so he could live unburdened. The Lighthouse, through its unique energetic properties, had recorded this profound act of sacrifice. It was an energy imprint, a psychic timestamp, echoing through the decades, waiting for someone with a similar connection to decipher it. Chapter 5, A New Horizon. The revelation was both devastating and liberating. Eleanor realized the whispers she had heard, the dreams that plagued her, were not just a premonition of personal pain, but a generational legacy. She was not only her mother's daughter, but also an inheritor of her mother's unique, mystical gift, the direct link to the emotional and energetic currents of the sea. Her mother had chosen to bury the truth, to silence the echoes, to shield her daughter from the burden of the gift and the pain of the sacrifice. But the echoes had found her anyway. With Ilara's help, Sarah began to learn to control her own connection, to understand it not as a curse, but as a profound inherited sensitivity. She spent days at the Lighthouse, meditating, listening, not to the cacophony of the past, but to the gentle rhythm of the present. She learned to decipher the subtle energies, to distinguish between echoes of old pain and the natural, vibrant life of the sea. She felt a profound connection to her mother, a deeper understanding of her quiet strength and her unspoken agony. Mary had not just been a keeper of the light. She had been a protector of lives, a silent guardian, sacrificing her own happiness for the survival of those she loved. The final piece of the puzzle, the most profound and emotional, came unexpectedly. Using old census records and family trees connected to the local fishing community, Ilara traced the distant cousin who had been on the boat with baby Thomas Jr. They found records of a family who had raised a boy named Thomas, born in 1954, after his parents tragically died at sea during the Great Storm of '55. He had grown up, married, and lived a quiet life in a nearby coastal town, never knowing his true parents or the extraordinary circumstances of his survival. He was Thomas Eldridge Jr., Mary's son, Sarah's half-brother. The meeting was tentative, filled with nervous energy and cautious hope. Thomas Jr., a kind, reserved man in his late 60s, listened in disbelief as Sarah, with Ilara's support, recounted the incredible story of his birth, his mother's sacrifice, and the enduring whispers of the Lighthouse. He had known nothing of his parents, only that they had been lost at sea. To learn that his mother, Mary, had not only saved him, but given up so much of herself to do so, was overwhelming. He came to the Lighthouse with Sarah, walking through its silent, empty chambers. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of deep orange and purple. Sarah felt the familiar hum, the whispers on the wind, but this time they were not cries of anguish. They were soft, comforting murmurs, words of love, of pride, of peace. She closed her eyes and saw a fleeting image of her mother, young Mary, smiling, a serene, luminous smile. It was a moment of profound healing, a bridge between two generations, two mothers, finally at peace. Sarah realized that her lifelong fascination with the lighthouse, her haunting dreams, and the inexplicable whispers were not random. They were her destiny, her inheritance. She was not just a librarian who had retired. She was the new guardian of the light story, the inheritor of a powerful ancestral gift. Identity, this mystical connection, drawing her back. She decided to stay. She began working with Alara to transform the old keeper's cottage into a research center for coastal phenomena and local history, a place where the stories of the sea could be preserved and understood. She would share her mother's journal, her own experiences, and the truth of Thomas Jr.'s incredible survival. She even began learning to sketch, inspired by Mary's artistic notes in the journal, drawing the lighthouse, the sea, the ever-present gulls. The lighthouse, once a symbol of tragic loss and unspoken secrets, now stood as a beacon of healing, of enduring love, and of the extraordinary connections that bind families across time and realms. Sarah had found not just answers, but a profound purpose, a sense of belonging she had never fully realized was missing. She finally understood that some truths are not found in books or archives, but in the echoes of silence, carried on the whispers of the wind, waiting for someone with a heart open enough to listen. And she, the lighthouse keeper's daughter, was finally home.